The room was still, heavy with the weight of formality. Papers shuffled, cameras clicked, and then he smirked. Justice William Alsup leaned back ever so slightly, lips curling into that unmistakable expression, the smirk of someone who believed the outcome was already his. It wasn't just a look, it was dismissal, it was condescension, it was the unspoken message, "You don't belong in this room the way I do." But across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fire back with raised volume or a heated outburst. No, her strength came differently. She held his gaze calm, unshaken, letting that silence stretch just long enough for everyone watching to feel the imbalance in the air. Then, with a voice measured and deliberate, she delivered a comeback so sharp, so undeniable, that the smirk on Alsup's face froze in real time. The moment landed like a gavel. The courtroom, once buzzing with side chatter and low murmurs, fell into silence. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath. Crockett's words, precise and fearless, cut through the posturing, the performance, the arrogance, and for the first time that day, Justice Alsup looked unsettled. Onlookers shifted in their seats. A few stifled gasps broke through. It was the kind of moment that replayed instantly in people's minds, burned into memory before the echo of her sentence had even faded. And beyond those walls, viewers across America who would later watch the clip asked themselves the same question. Did that really just happen in a courtroom because it wasn't supposed to unfold this way? Judges smirk. Politicians stumble, but rarely, so rarely, does the script flip with such clarity, such force, such dignity. But to understand why this comeback shook the room, we have to step back into the arrogance, the history, and the storm about to break. This was never just another courtroom exchange. What unfolded between Justice William Alsup and Representative Jasmine Crockett carried stakes far beyond a single smirk or a single comeback. On the surface, it was a hearing, a place of procedure, precedent, and debate. But beneath that veneer, it was something far larger. A collision of values, a test of whether dignity could still triumph over dismissal in America's halls of power. Alsup entered the room with the confidence of a man who had worn the robe for decades. His authority was his armor. The smirk was not a slip, it was a signal. To him, the courtroom was a stage he controlled, and he had no doubt he would command the scene. The weight of his position gave him certainty that any challenge could be brushed aside with a smirk, a sigh, or a wave of judicial language. He believed in hierarchy. He believed in order. And most of all, he believed that he was untouchable. Crockett, on the other hand, came prepared in a different way. She wasn't draped in institutional power. She didn't rely on robes or titles. Her preparation was built on something more enduring, lived experience, resilience, and relentless truth-telling. She sat quietly, composed, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. It was the calm of someone who knew storms by name, who had weathered worse and endured longer. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to hold a mirror up to arrogance. That contrast Alsup's smirk against Crockett's silence wasn't lost on anyone in the room. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a mismatch. A senior judge exuding authority versus a young congresswoman biding her time. But to those paying attention, the tension told a different story. This wasn't a clash of individuals, it was dignity versus dismissal. It was accountability against elitism. Every question, every exchange carried weight. Crockett represented more than herself. She carried with her the frustrations of people who had been told to wait their turn, who had been smirked at, spoken over, brushed aside. Alsup, knowingly or not, represented the long tradition of arrogance cloaked in authority, the belief that power alone was proof of being right. The stakes grew with every passing second. This wasn't just about exposing hypocrisy in the moment. It was about whether truth could still puncture power. Could someone armed with facts, composure, and courage make the smirk of authority falter? Could the dignity of lived truth silence the dismissal of hierarchy? Viewers watching felt that weight even before the viral moment arrived. They sensed the imbalance, the injustice, the unspoken challenge. They wanted the tables to turn. They wanted to see the smirk wiped away, not out of spite, but out of hunger for fairness. And that hunger is what made the eventual comeback so powerful. Because when dignity finally strikes back, it doesn't just correct, it inspires. It validates. It shows everyone watching that arrogance is not invincible, that elitism can be challenged, that silence can be shattered. And just when Alsup thought his smirk would end the moment, Crockett turned it into the beginning of his unraveling. To understand why Justice William Alsup's smirk carried so much weight, and why its unraveling mattered, you have to look at the man behind the robe. His reputation was never one of warmth or humility. Among those who studied his career, there was a pattern: sharp intelligence wrapped in sharper arrogance. He was known not just for his rulings, but for the way he delivered them, smug, unyielding, and often dismissive of those who dared to challenge him. In the courtroom, Alsup wielded authority like a blade. His questions often came laced with condescension, as if reminding litigants and lawyers alike that he was the smartest man in the room. Even when he wasn't speaking, his body language told its own story: the raised eyebrow, the half smile that bordered on mockery, the smirk that implied, "I already know the answer and you'll never measure up." To some, he was a master of the bench. To others, he was the embodiment of judicial aloofness, so certain of his own brilliance that he could no longer hear the people standing before him. There were moments in his career that reflected this pattern clearly. Critics pointed to rulings that seemed less about justice and more about flexing judicial power. His words in certain cases carried undertones of tone deafness, revealing a man far more comfortable defending entrenched systems than grappling with the lived realities of those impacted by them. He spoke often of law as if it were a neutral force, untouched by bias, even as communities cried out that the very system he upheld often failed them. That was Alsup's contradiction. He claimed impartiality while displaying arrogance. He wore the robe as if it were armor, but underneath, the cracks were visible. His smirk, his dismissals, his casual superiority, they were all defenses, covering a fragility he would never admit to. For a man who projected so much certainty, his record showed inconsistency. For someone who demanded respect for the law, he too often embodied the elitism that made people distrust the system in the first place. And those contradictions built his villain arc. In cinematic terms, Alsup became the archetype of the authority figure who mistakes control for truth. His courtroom persona was less about fairness and more about dominance. He believed that to question him was to be wrong by default. His power came not from persuasion, but from position. Yet the higher one builds on arrogance, the farther there is to fall. Viewers watching him in that hearing didn't just see a judge. They saw a symbol of something larger. The gatekeepers of power who roll their eyes at challenges, who smirk when confronted, who act as if their authority makes them invincible. Alsup wasn't unique. He represented an entire culture of dismissal that many had experienced in classrooms, workplaces, and politics. His smirk in that moment became more than a facial expression. It was the mask of arrogance itself. But masks have limits. They can hide the insecurity beneath, but they can't erase it. And Alsup's cracks had already begun to show. He underestimated how his tone, deafness would look outside the insulated walls of the courtroom. He failed to see how the rise of social media changed the terrain, that every smirk, every remark, every gesture could be clipped, shared, and dissected. What once went unnoticed by the public now had the power to go viral in seconds. In that hearing, his confidence was the very seed of his undoing. Because arrogance has one fatal flaw: it cannot imagine being challenged, and when it is, it falters. Alsup's smirk wasn't just an expression. It was foreshadowing. It revealed how certain he was that his authority would stand unshaken. But in truth, it was a mask stretched too thin, one that a single strike of dignity could shatter. That's what made the moment so cinematic. The villain wasn't a man plotting in shadows. It was a man so sure of his own superiority that he couldn't see the reckoning coming. His downfall wasn't forged in malice. It was born of arrogance, of believing the robe would protect him forever. But while Alsup's mask was built on arrogance, Crockett's story was forged in something far stronger. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's comeback struck so deeply, you have to know the woman behind the words, because Crockett didn't walk into that hearing with the armor of a robe or the entitlement of rank. She walked in carrying something heavier, something harder to earn, a lifetime of grit, dignity, and the kind of truth that doesn't need permission to speak. Crockett's journey was never smooth. She didn't come from privilege, she came from persistence. Long before her name was trending on social media, long before she earned a seat in Congress, she was a young woman fighting battles that demanded resilience. She knew what it was to be underestimated, to be told she didn't belong, to be met with the dismissive smirk of those who thought authority was the same as wisdom. Those experiences didn't break her, they built her. Her advocacy began at the ground level, defending people who rarely had a voice in the system. As a public defender, she wasn't facing abstract debates about the law. She was facing real lives, real families, and real injustices. Each case sharpened her resolve. Each story she carried reminded her of the stakes when power goes unchecked. While Alsup wielded law like a weapon of superiority, Crockett wielded it as a shield for those forgotten. She learned quickly that justice wasn't automatic. It had to be fought for again and again, and fight she did. Her rise to Congress wasn't gifted to her. It was won through organizing, through speaking uncomfortable truths, through standing in rooms where she wasn't supposed to stand and refusing to sit down. Where others might have softened their voice to blend in, she sharpened hers to be heard. Where Alsup cloaked himself in aloofness, Crockett wrapped herself in authenticity. That authenticity became her greatest weapon, because people can sense when a leader is real. Her speeches weren't rehearsed performances meant to impress the powerful, they were extensions of her lived reality. She spoke in a language of resilience, a cadence of conviction. For every person who had ever been smirked at, dismissed, or told to wait their turn, she became a vessel of validation. It wasn't just that she spoke truth, it was that she lived it. She carried the identity of someone who knew what it meant to fight uphill battles and still keep her dignity intact. While Alsup relied on hierarchy, Crockett relied on humanity. While he floated above the people, she stood among them. This difference, the smug aloofness of Alsup versus the grounded resilience of Crockett, wasn't just symbolic. It was transformational, because when they eventually clashed, it wouldn't be authority versus authority. It would be arrogance versus authenticity, and authenticity has a way of piercing even the thickest armor. Crockett's rise into Congress only amplified that truth. She didn't arrive to play it safe. She arrived to challenge the very structures that silence people like her. In a chamber too often dominated by entitlement and performative power, her presence was a reminder. America's future isn't built by those who smirk from pedestals, but by those who know the struggle of the ground. That's why people felt pride watching her. She wasn't just a congresswoman taking on a judge. She was a mirror of their own battles, their own grit, their own refusal to bow down to arrogance. Her lived experiences had prepared her not just to survive moments like this hearing, but to own them. Every obstacle she had faced had trained her for composure under pressure, for clarity in chaos, for turning dismissal into fuel, and that preparation mattered. Because in the theater of politics and power, the person with the loudest title doesn't always win. The person with the deepest truth does. Crockett carried that truth like a torch, lighting a path that others could follow. She was proof that dignity is not passive. It is active, resilient, and stronger than arrogance could ever be. So when the moment came, when Alsup's smirk tried to dismiss her, when centuries of judicial aloofness seemed to bear down on her, she wasn't intimidated, she was ready. Ready because her story had taught her that arrogance always underestimates dignity. Ready because she knew that silence isn't submission, it's strategy. Ready because her entire life had been preparing her for this exact confrontation. The audience watching felt that too. They didn't just see Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman. They saw Jasmine Crockett, the fighter, the advocate, the woman who refused to be erased. They felt connected, empowered, validated by her presence, and when her comeback finally came, it didn't just silence a smirk, it spoke for everyone who had ever been dismissed. So when their paths collided in that hearing room, history was waiting. Alsup opened the hearing with the practiced assurance of a man who had seen every argument and dismissed most of them. He settled into his chair with a slight smirk, a subtle curl at the corner of his mouth that said he already knew how this would go. Microphones hummed, recorders clicked, the public gallery murmured. He spoke in the measured cadence of authority, peppering legalese with a tone that implied the room should yield to his experience. Crockett listened. She did not rush. She made no grand entrance. Her composure was quiet but implacable. She let his words fill the air and catalogued each one with a steady, attentive gaze. When Alsup interrupted or brushed aside a question, she did not react theatrically. Instead, she folded the moment into her reserve, like a strategist collecting ammunition. The contrast was stark, his performance loud in its confidence, hers potent in its restraint. The exchanges began routine procedural questions, references to precedent, polite jostling over semantics. But there was an undertow. Each time Alsup offered a dismissive aside, the smirk softened into a sharper edge. Every condescending aside landed like a small stone on the surface of Crockett's patience. The camera caught the micro, movements others might miss, the click of a pen, a tightened jaw, a breath held too long. Those tiny details loaded the scene with anticipation. As the hearing progressed, Alsup pressed harder. He leaned forward on a point of procedure, framing it with the authority of precedent. His voice carried impatience now, a hint that he felt the need to assert control. He asked questions that were less about clarification and more about dominance. At times he spoke over witnesses, dismissing concerns with a wave. He assumed the cadence of someone determined to set the tempo and keep it. Crockett responded not with force but with focus. She interjected only when necessary, choosing words like surgical instruments, precise, concise, impossible to misread. When she posed a question, it landed with clarity. When she challenged an assumption, she did so with calm evidence rather than flourish. In those moments, her eyes locked on Alsup's face with a steady, unyielding steadiness that felt like a warning. The room watched. Spectators leaned forward. Reporters scrolled through notes, searching for the crack. Social media watchers would later replay the scene frame by frame. The tension increased incrementally, a series of tiny escalations that together formed a crescendo. The question became less about policy and more about temperament. Who would show weakness first? Alsup tried to maintain control. He smirked more, adjusted his tie, flicked a legal book as if to remind others where authority truly resided. Yet each flourish revealed impatience, an undercurrent of vulnerability. Crockett's silence was no longer passive. It pressed. It required a response. He tightened. He searched for a retort and found words that sounded brittle against the steady rhythm of her calm. At a pivotal exchange, Alsup attempted a dismissive quip meant to undercut her position. For a breath, the room waited for her to erupt. She didn't. Instead, she collected his quip, then returned it with a measured correction that carried the weight of evidence and history. The correction landed like a pivot, simple, unavoidable, and precise. Faces exchanged glances. A murmur moved through the gallery like wind through leaves. Every subtle motion counted. The slight tightening of Alsup's knuckles, the way his eyes darted toward an aide, the dry rasp in his throat when he tried to reclaim the rhythm. Crockett's breathing was even, her hands unclenched, an unspoken confidence radiating from the floor between them. Television viewers registered the change. Commentators paused mid-sentence. People who had expected a perfunctory exchange realized they were witnessing something rare. A slow, deliberate unseating of assumed power, a lesson in how discipline and truth can puncture theatrical authority when patience is executed like a strategy. The momentum shifted. It was subtle at first, a hesitation where there had been certainty, the smirk faltering, the confident posture giving way to small, revealing gestures. The audience, sensing the change, leaned in further. The central suspense that had loomed, who would crack first, now felt palpable, and then Crockett unleashed the moment no one could have predicted. The smirk was still there when Crockett leaned forward, her notes in front of her but untouched. She didn't need them. Her voice came calm, steady, deliberate, the kind of calm that slices sharper than any outburst. The room seemed to shrink with her words, as though every ear instinctively tuned in. "Justice Alsup," she began, her tone polite, almost disarmingly so. "I'd like to revisit something you said, not today, but in your own remarks from just a few years ago." The smirk flickered, barely perceptible, but it faltered for a fraction of a second. Alsup adjusted his robe at the shoulder, trying to mask it with another curl of superiority at the edge of his mouth. But Crockett wasn't rushing. She let the silence stretch. She let the anticipation build. The pause was intentional, cinematic. The kind of pause that makes a room hold its breath. "In 2019, she continued, "you spoke publicly about the responsibility of judges to uphold dignity in their courtroom. You said, and I quote, 'Arrogance has no place in the pursuit of justice.'" The words landed like a strike of lightning. The smirk cracked. A hush swept through the gallery. Even the shuffle of papers ceased. Alsup blinked, his expression stiffening. The irony of his own words being laid before him, words now weaponized against the very demeanor he had carried into this hearing, hung in the air like smoke. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let his words linger, repeated them again, slower, crisper. "Arrogance has no place in the pursuit of justice." The silence that followed was deafening. One could almost hear the pounding hearts of staffers at their desks, the faint tapping of someone's shoe against the floor, the collective breath of an audience that knew they had just witnessed a turning point. Alsup shifted in his chair, his hands folded, then unfolded. He cleared his throat as if searching for a response, but none came. The smirk, the shield he had wielded all day, was gone. In its place was something else, the weight of being cornered by his own past conviction. The room reacted in subtle waves. A stifled laugh here, a raised eyebrow there. Journalists typing furiously, already imagining the headlines. Congresswoman quotes judge's own words back at him. The tension that had built through the hearing now released in murmurs, gasps, and knowing glances exchanged across the gallery. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, voice still calm, still surgical. "So I ask you today, if arrogance has no place in the pursuit of justice, then what do we call a smirk when questions about accountability are raised? What do we call dismissal when dignity is at stake?" The words hung like daggers, not shouted, not screamed, simply placed with precision, impossible to ignore. Her cadence slowed, deliberate, the rhythm of someone who knew the exact weight of every syllable. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a mirror held firmly and unflinchingly in front of Alsup, and in that mirror the room saw him falter. For the first time, Alsup looked less like the unshakable arbiter of the law and more like a man exposed, his contradictions laid bare. He attempted to recover, drawing breath to respond, but the pause was too long, the silence too heavy. By the time he found words, the moment had already slipped from his control. Cameras caught it all. The frame would later be replayed thousands of times. Alsup blinking, smirk vanished, mouth slightly open but voiceless, while Crockett sat calm, resolute, and unshaken. Social media didn't wait. Phones in the gallery buzzed as the clip was shared, posted, captioned with phrases like savage, mic drop moment, and Crockett just ended him with his own words. Imagine Twitter timelines lit up in real time. She just quoted him to himself. Absolute legend. That smirk gone, history was made right here. Jasmine Crockett proving again that dignity arrogance every single time. Memes were already in the making. Someone clipped Alsup's smirk before the takedown and placed it side by side with the frame where his face fell flat, captioned, "Expectation vs. Reality." Another paired Crockett's line with slow-motion replay, dramatic music swelling in the background, the words "Arrogance has no place," flashing across the screen, but inside the room, before the outside world caught fire, the emotion was raw. Spectators leaned back, wide-eyed, whispering to one another. The energy was electric. Even those who might not have shared Crockett's politics couldn't deny the mastery of the moment. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a dismantling. And perhaps most powerful of all, Crockett didn't celebrate. She didn't grin or pump a fist. She sat back, composed, letting the silence speak for itself. That restraint magnified the impact. It was dignity embodied. The contrast with Alsup's earlier smugness was complete. For those watching from home, the catharsis was overwhelming. People who had ever been dismissed, laughed at, or spoken over felt vindicated. This wasn't just Crockett against Alsup. It was dignity against every smirk they had endured. Her words, her calm, her precision gave validation to millions who knew what it meant to face arrogance and refuse to bow. It was more than a mic drop. It was a masterclass in restraint, composure, and the devastating power of turning someone's own words into their undoing. And as Alsup sat there, stripped of the smirk that had defined him, the echo of Crockett's voice still filling the chamber, one truth was undeniable: the balance of power had shifted. But this was only the beginning, because once the clip hit the internet, the reaction was explosive. The clip didn't just spread, it detonated. Within minutes of Crockett's mic drop counterattack, phones in the gallery buzzed with notifications. By the time the hearing adjourned, the moment had already leapt beyond the walls of that chamber and onto millions of screens across the country. The first hashtag was simple: #Arrogance has no place. It started with a single tweet, a reporter's raw video of Crockett quoting Alsup back to himself. Within an hour, it was trending nationwide. Soon it was joined by #Smirk silenced and #Crockett vs Alsup, each carrying thousands of retweets, reactions, and memes. On TikTok, the clip took on a life of its own. Creators layered Crockett's words over slow-motion edits, pairing her calm delivery with booming bass drops and captions like, "When dignity ends arrogance." Others spliced the footage into reaction videos, showing themselves gasping, cheering, or literally falling out of chairs. One viral TikTok simply looped Alsup's smirk, dissolving frame by frame, set to the caption, "When your own words end your career." Late-night comedians didn't waste a beat. By that evening, monologues were riffing on the downfall. One host quipped, "That wasn't a comeback. It was a courtroom obituary," while another compared Alsup's smirk to a Wi-Fi signal that vanished mid-sentence. The laughter carried through living rooms, but beneath the humor was a recognition. This was a cultural moment. Ordinary families at home replayed the clip over dinner. Parents called teenagers into the room. "You have to see this." Students in dorms erupted into cheers, phones lighting up as group chats overflowed with messages. "Did you catch Crockett just now?" Friends texted each other in real time. "Watch the clip." Unreal. For many, the moment wasn't just entertaining. It was vindicating. It felt like justice playing out in real time, raw and unscripted. Meanwhile, Alsup was scrambling. His office released no statement that day, no clarification, no attempt at spin. Reporters called for comment, but silence came back. Silence and a lingering image of a man stripped of his authority in the most public way possible. While Crockett's composure was celebrated as iconic, Alsup's smirk became a meme, an image forever frozen in digital amber. Celebrities joined the wave. A-list actors retweeted the clip with captions like "Queen behavior," and "This is how you handle arrogance." Musicians remixed Crockett's voice into tracks, one looping her line, "Arrogance has no place in the pursuit of justice," over a beat that hit the charts on SoundCloud by morning. Athletes posted it to their stories with fire emojis. The clip crossed boundaries of politics and culture, moving from hearing rooms to sports arenas, music studios, and everyday conversations. The ripple effects reached mainstream media fast. Cable news replayed the exchange on loop, each network framing it in their own way, but all agreeing on one point: This was unforgettable. Analysts debated whether Alsup's career could recover, while others focused on Crockett's rising profile as a political star. Editorials praised her discipline, contrasting it with Alsup's arrogance. Commentators highlighted the symbolism: a young congresswoman holding a senior judge accountable with nothing more than his own words. And then came the wave of audience validation. Across platforms, ordinary people poured their stories into the moment. "I've had bosses smirk at me like that. Seeing him silenced felt like justice for all of us." I'm a law student, and let me tell you, this is the kind of clarity we dream of delivering. Crockett didn't just clap back, she gave voice to everyone who's been dismissed. The resonance wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Viewers saw their own lives reflected in the power dynamic. They had all faced their own versions of Alsups: mugged teachers, arrogant supervisors, dismissive officials. Watching Crockett dismantle that smirk felt like redemption, not only for her but for everyone who had ever been belittled. By the next day, the clip wasn't just viral, it was legend. News tickers ran updates on its reach. Social media platforms recorded millions of engagements, and everywhere, conversations circled back to one truth: dignity had spoken louder than arrogance. But beyond the memes and trending tags, something deeper was happening. When the echoes of Crockett's words finally settled, what lingered was not just the sound of her voice, but the meaning of the moment. For in that instant, she had reframed everything. This was no longer about a smirk, a comeback, or even the clash between a congresswoman and a judge. It was about truth standing taller than arrogance, about dignity enduring longer than power. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't revel in Alsup's discomfort. Instead, she held the space with poise, her presence embodying a larger principle: justice demands humility. In a room built on authority and precedent, she reminded everyone that true authority comes from honesty, not smugness. That was the turning point when the narrative shifted from a viral clapback to a lesson in leadership. Crockett made it clear, whether by words spoken aloud or by the example she set, that accountability isn't optional. Arrogance might smirk in the moment, but truth has a way of waiting patiently, and then prevailing. This was why the moment resonated far beyond Washington. It wasn't about the personalities alone, it was about what they represented. Alsup symbolized the kind of dismissive elitism that too many Americans have faced in their workplaces, their schools, even in courtrooms. Crockett symbolized resilience, dignity, and the refusal to shrink in the face of dismissal. She showed that even in halls dominated by power, grace and grit could still cut through. The inspirational crescendo came not from the takedown itself, but from what it meant: that no matter how high the pedestal, hypocrisy can be toppled when confronted with truth. That arrogance may draw attention, but authenticity draws respect, and that justice, real justice, belongs to everyone, not just those who wear the robe or sit behind the bench. For her supporters, it was a moment of vindication. For her critics, it was undeniable proof of her strength. And for America at large, it was a mirror. It forced the country to ask, who do we want to be? A nation where smugness reigns, or a nation where dignity stands tall? The lesson was universal. This wasn't just Crockett vs. Alsup. It wasn't just a viral video. It was a parable about what happens when truth collides with arrogance. It was a reminder that silence in the face of dismissal is not weakness. It is strategy. And when that silence breaks, it can shatter illusions with a single line. Crockett's triumph wasn't measured in applause or headlines, but in the way people carried it with them. Students walked into classrooms standing a little taller. Workers entered meetings refusing to shrink when dismissed. Every day people saw themselves in her composure, her courage, her refusal to flinch. The clash may have started with a smirk, but it ended with a universal truth: dignity always outlasts arrogance. And so, the viral clip wasn't just about one smirk, it became a mirror for America itself. The smirk said it all. William Alsup, leaning into years of authority, thought the moment belonged to him. But Jasmine Crockett's savage comeback turned that fleeting grin into a symbol of arrogance undone. What began as a dismissive glance became a viral showdown, one that reminded the country where true power lies, because Crockett didn't just silence a judge, she silenced the idea that arrogance wins. She proved that dignity, carried with patience and precision, outlasts even the loudest displays of condescension. And in doing so, she gave voice to millions who have sat in rooms just like that, dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, waiting for the chance to stand tall. That's why this clip hit so hard. It wasn't only about her words, but what they represented, a victory for truth, resilience, and accountability, a reminder that arrogance fades but honesty echoes, that power can posture but dignity speaks louder. And now the question shifts to you. Will you help amplify moments like this, moments that cut through arrogance and remind America of who we are meant to be? Subscribe to this channel for more stories where truth triumphs over posturing. Share this video so others can feel the same surge of validation and pride. Be part of the movement that refuses to let smugness and elitism define our future. Because every time we lift up voices like Crockett's, we strengthen our own. Every share, every comment, every subscription isn't just engagement. It's a statement that we will not let arrogance drown out dignity. And in the end, moments like these remind us dignity will always speak louder than power.